A hand rose from the audience. Johnny Carson saw it and stopped his monologue mid-sentence. That woman had waited 40 years. And she was finally ready to speak. It was March 1982. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. Another Thursday night. Another packed house of 300 eager audience members. Another monologue full of jokes about politics and pop culture. Johnny was hitting his stride. The audience was laughing. Ed McMahon was doing his signature chuckle from the sideboard. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready for the commercial break. Everything was running exactly as it should. Johnny was in the middle of a joke about the economy when he noticed it. A hand, trembling, raised hesitantly in the 6th row of the audience. It wasn't unusual for audience members to react during the monologue. People waved, laughed, pointed at friends. But this was different. This hand wasn't waving enthusiastically. It was raised with the careful determination of someone who had been waiting for a very specific moment, and was terrified to let it pass. Johnny stopped talking. Mid-sentence. Mid-joke. The punchline died on his lips. The audience noticed the shift immediately. The laughter faded into confused silence. Johnny squinted slightly, looking past the stage lights into the audience. "Yes?" he said, his voice carrying that mix of curiosity and caution he used when something unexpected happened. "You in the 6th row. Did you have a question?" The woman stood up slowly. She was elderly, late 60s, maybe 70. She wore a simple dress, modest and neat. Her hair was silver, pulled back. Her hands were shaking. "Mr. Carson," she said, her voice barely audible, "I need to tell you something. I've waited 40 years to say this." Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. The control room erupted into chaos. Director Bobby Quinn grabbed his headset. "What's happening? Is this planned? Fred, is this in the rundown?" Producer Fred DeCordova stood behind Bobby, staring at the monitors. "No. This isn't planned. But keep rolling. Don't cut." On stage, Johnny had abandoned his cue cards completely. They lay scattered on his desk, forgotten. He took a step toward the edge of the stage, one hand shading his eyes from the lights so he could see the woman better. 40 years? Johnny repeated. "Ma'am, I've only been doing this show for 20 years. "I know," the woman said, tears already streaming down her face. "But I've been waiting since 1942. Since you were 17 years old. Since Norfolk, Nebraska." The studio went completely silent. Even Ed McMahon, who had seen everything in his decades with Johnny, looked stunned. Johnny's face changed. The practiced smile vanished. His jaw tightened. His eyes widened slightly, not with confusion but with something deeper. Recognition. Maybe even fear. "Norfolk," Johnny said quietly, more to himself than to her. Then louder. "What's your name?" "Eleanor Patterson," the woman said. "You wouldn't remember me. But you knew my brother. Harold Patterson. You called him Harry." Johnny took another step forward. His hand gripped the edge of his desk. "Harry Patterson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "From the naval station." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak for a moment, her hand pressed to her mouth. The audience sat in confused silence, 300 people sensing they were witnessing something profound but not understanding what. Johnny looked at Ed McMahon. Ed looked back, his expression asking the silent question, "Do you want to stop? Do you want to go to commercial?" Johnny shook his head slightly. "No. Keep going." He turned back to Eleanor. "Ma'am. Eleanor, would you come down here? Please?" To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1942. Johnny Carson wasn't always Johnny Carson, king of late-night television. In 1942, he was 17 years old, a skinny kid from Norfolk, Nebraska, with a passion for magic tricks and radio shows. World War II was raging. Boys Johnny's age were enlisting as soon as they turned 18, desperate to serve, to be heroes, to be part of something bigger than their small towns. Johnny wanted to enlist too. He'd spend hours listening to war reports on the radio, imagining himself in a bomber jacket, flying missions over Europe, coming home a decorated veteran. But Johnny had a problem. He was 17. Too young. He had to wait until his birthday in October before he could sign up. That summer, he got a job at the Norfolk Naval Ammunition Depot, a massive facility where they stored and distributed ammunition for the Pacific Theater. It wasn't combat, but it was war work. Johnny felt like he was contributing, even in some small way. That's where he met Harry Patterson. Harry was 19, a civilian worker like Johnny. He tried to enlist twice and been rejected both times for a heart murmur the military doctors said made him unfit for service. Harry was devastated. All his friends were shipping out to Europe and the Pacific, and he was stuck in Norfolk loading ammunition crates. Johnny and Harry became friends quickly. They worked the same shift, ate lunch together, talked about girls and baseball, and what they'd do when the war was over. Harry was funny, quick with a joke, always making the other workers laugh. He reminded Johnny of the radio comedians he admired. One August afternoon, during their lunch break, Harry and Johnny sat on the loading dock, eating sandwiches and watching storm clouds gather over the plains. "You know what I'm gonna do when this war ends?" Harry said, staring at the horizon. "I'm gonna travel. See the ocean. Maybe California. Get as far from Nebraska as I can." Johnny laughed. "You say that every week." "I mean it this time," Harry insisted. "I'm serious, Johnny. Life's too short to spend it all in one place. You gotta take chances. You gotta actually live, you know?" "Easy for you to say," Johnny replied. "You've got a heart murmur. I've got nothing holding me back. When I turn 18, I'm enlisting. I'll probably be in Europe by Christmas." Harry looked at him seriously. "Promise me something." "What?" "When you get back from the war, when you're done being a hero or whatever, promise me you'll actually live. Don't just exist. Don't settle for small. Do something big. Something that matters." Johnny rolled his eyes. "You sound like a motivational speaker." "I'm serious," Harry said. "Promise me." "Fine," Johnny said, holding up his hand in mock oath. "I promise. When I get back, I'll do something big." They shook on it, laughing, and went back to work. 3 weeks later, on August 19, 1942, there was an explosion at the Norfolk Naval Ammunition Depot. A storage shed ignited. The fire spread to multiple buildings. Ammunition detonated in chain reactions. The explosions could be heard 20 miles away. Harry Patterson was in Building 7 when it went up. He died instantly, along with 4 other civilian workers. The Navy locked down the depot immediately. Families were notified. Funerals were held quietly. The military didn't want publicity about accidents at munition facilities during wartime. Johnny Carson, 17 years old, attended Harry's funeral in a borrowed suit. He stood in the back of the church and listened to Eleanor Patterson, Harry's younger sister, 16 years old, give the eulogy. She talked about her brother's humor, his dreams of seeing California, his frustration at not being able to serve. Johnny never spoke to Eleanor that day. Never introduced himself. He was just another face in the crowd of mourners. But he never forgot his promise to Harry. When the war ended and Johnny came home, he didn't settle for small. He went to Los Angeles. He tried radio, then television. He took every chance, every risk. He built a career that millions of people watched every night. And he never told anyone about Harry Patterson or the promise he made on that loading dock in Norfolk, Nebraska. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Eleanor Patterson was walking slowly down the aisle toward the stage. Johnny had come around from behind his desk and was standing at the edge of the platform, waiting for her. The audience was completely silent. Some people were crying, though they didn't fully understand why yet. When Eleanor reached the stage, Johnny helped her up the 2 steps. He guided her gently to the guest chair. The same chair where movie stars and musicians usually sat, and pulled over a second chair for himself. Not his desk chair. Just a regular chair. He sat down facing her, knees almost touching, the way you sit when you're having a conversation that matters. "Tell me," Johnny said quietly, though his microphone picked it up perfectly. "How did you know? About the promise?" Eleanor reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out a small notebook. Worn. Pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully. "This was Harry's," she said. "His diary. I found it after he died, when we were cleaning out his room. He wrote in it every day that summer. And on August 1st, 1942, he wrote about having lunch with a kid named Johnny Carson who wanted to be on the radio someday." She held the notebook so Johnny could see. Her finger pointed to a specific line, written in faded pencil. "Made Johnny promise he'd do something big when the war is over. I think he will. That kid's got something special." Johnny's face crumpled. His jaw clenched. His eyes filled with tears. He reached out and touched the page gently, like it might disintegrate. "I've carried this notebook for 40 years. Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "I read it sometimes when I miss him. And I always wondered about you, the Johnny Carson who made my brother laugh that summer. I wondered if you kept your promise." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Then I turned on the television one night in 1962 and saw you hosting The Tonight Show. And I knew. You kept your promise. You did something big. You did exactly what Harry believed you would do." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. The control room was in chaos. Producers were whispering frantically. Commercial breaks were being rescheduled. No one knew what to do because nothing like this had ever happened before. But Johnny wasn't thinking about the schedule. He was looking at Eleanor Patterson, at this woman who had carried her brother's notebook for 4 decades, who had watched Johnny's career from a distance, and never said a word until tonight. "Why now?" Johnny asked gently. "Eleanor, why did you wait until tonight to tell me this?" She smiled through her tears. "Because I'm 71 years old, Mr. Carson. And I have lung cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. And I realize..." Her voice broke. "I realized I couldn't die without telling you. Without letting you know that Harry saw something in you. That his last summer on Earth, he had a friend who made him laugh. That his death wasn't meaningless because you turned his dream into reality." The studio audience was sobbing now. Not polite tears. Real, chest-heaving sobs. Ed McMahon had his face in his hands. Doc Severinsen had turned away from his music stand, wiping his eyes. Johnny Carson, who had interviewed thousands of guests over 20 years, who had maintained perfect composure through every awkward moment and surprising revelation, was crying openly on live television. He reached forward and took Eleanor's hands in his. "Harry was my friend," Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. "And when he died, I was 17 and didn't know how to process that loss. So I kept the promise. But I never talked about him. I never told anyone. And I'm sorry for that." Eleanor shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. You lived the promise. That's what matters. Harry would be so proud." Johnny stood up and helped Eleanor to her feet. Then he did something unprecedented. He walked to his desk, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a pen, his father's fountain pen, the one he'd carried since starting The Tonight Show. He handed it to Eleanor. "This belonged to my father. He gave it to me when I got this job. It's the most valuable thing I own. I want you to have it. And I want you to write something in Harry's notebook. Write that I kept the promise. Write that I never forgot him." Eleanor clutched the pen to her chest, sobbing. The audience rose as one. Standing ovation. Not for entertainment, but for 2 people honoring a boy who died 40 years ago. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Johnny spent an hour with Eleanor backstage. He had the notebook professionally preserved. When Eleanor passed away 7 months later, her family returned it to Johnny with a note. Harry's promise is complete. Johnny kept that notebook in his desk until his final show in 1992. In his last monologue, he mentioned Harry Patterson by name for the first time on television. The fountain pen? Eleanor was buried with it.